So we've talked about the worst. It's time to talk about the best. I read many, 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 many books this year that were just so good, like amazing. If this list could have been much longer, great. I limited myself to 10 books for this because I read a lot of books that were really, really good, some that are probably going to be new favorites, and I read some that were good and probably could have gone on this list if it was longer, but we don't need to be talking all day. I am not Books and La, and y'all did not come here for a 40-minute long video. The first book I'm going to talk about is Beartown by Frederick Bachman. I think that reading that when I did helped me really connect with that book. I read it in January, but it takes place in Alaska, I think. And it's cold and it's dreary and it's about a hockey town and small town vibes, and then what happens when there's drama. And being from a small town, I can see this happening, and I really connect with how a lot of the characters reacted to things. I like that there weren't any flat characters, even ones that were, bad. You're like, oh no, I can understand where this came from. But the book never went, yeah, this trauma excuses their behavior. The book went, hey, everyone has trauma, and sometimes that trauma can be brought onto someone else because they didn't deal with it in a healthy way. And I really appreciated that message. I'm hoping to get to the sequel sometime this year. I may pick that up in January. But either way, I've got more Bachman on this shelf back here that I need to pick up. But Beartown definitely made it into the top 10. The next book that goes into my top 10 is my girl Margaret Atwood with The Handmaid's Tale. This is the second time I've read it. It was the first time I'd read it as an adult, English major. When I read it before in high school, I did like it, but I didn't appreciate it, I think, for what it was as literature. But I did appreciate the story. Now I can appreciate it for the well-crafted story it is about stories. This novel, as speculative fiction and feminist as it is, it really does look into why we tell stories. What is the value of having your own voice for your own story? And at some point I'm going to sit down and make that video about this novel and why this book is so important. But I just don't have enough time right now in this top 10 to go into how much I love this book, but it definitely made it into my top 10 easy. The next book in my top 10 is Stephen Graham Jones. He honestly could have been in here twice, but I had to pick which one I liked more out of Night of the Mannequins and The Only Good Indians, and I chose The Only Good Indians. The Only Good Indians is amazing. If you haven't read it and you like horror, if you call yourself a horror fan, you need to read The Only Good Indians. It is crawling and it is anxious and tense. There were parts near the end where I couldn't breathe because I was so uncomfortable, and then the horror graphic gore stuff starts happening, and it's just, I had to put the book down. There are very few books that I've read, even Stephen King books that I've read, where I've had to set the book down and walk away from it for a minute. But if you get to the part near the end that I'm talking about, you'll know exactly what it is, because I just had to physically remove myself from it. It's that good, and the story is really good. It's about generational trauma and the sins of the fathers enacted on the children, and I don't have the cultural knowledge that some would in reading this, but I really got a lot out of it anyway. I can only imagine how powerful this book would be if you had grown up in these kind of situations and if you had grown up in this culture. But I really don't understand people who were not fans of this, they couldn't relate to the characters. I found these very relatable characters, and again, I think part of that is it still had small town vibes. It had small town cultural vibes, so that helped. But The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones, immediate new favorite. The next book that goes on this list is Woven in Moonlight by Isabel Ibanez. I read this, I think, in almost one sitting. I think it took me a day and a half. And if you don't know about Woven in Moonlight, it is about a girl who she can weave moonlight into things. She passes for a princess to go marry their arch rival, the king, in order to help her people out, but she's not really the princess, and she ends up kind of falling for this guy who is helping out save people, and it's Mask of Zorro but fantasy, and it's so good. And we love masked characters and mutual pining. That's all I need to say. It's beautiful and vivid and colorful. It needs to be an animated movie. You know what I'm saying? This needs the animated series or animated movie treatment, because it would just be gorgeous. Next book on this list is Take a Hint, Danny Brown by Talia Hibbert. I read 2 of her books this year. I read that one and At Your Age, Eve Brown, and this one gets it by a landslide, only because I appreciated these 2 characters interacting with each other a lot better than I did in Eve Brown, even though they were great too. It's kind of apples to oranges. I like fake relationship tropes. I like mutual pining tropes. I like that these characters in Talia Hibbert's books have to sort of like self-reflect before they become like dateable to someone else. They have to figure out what's, you know, what they're bringing to the table. If I could learn how to speak. But I really like that that's what she seems to do in these books, and I just think Dani Brown gets that. Now, I've never read the first one. Most people seem to like the first one better than the other 2, but me personally, Take a Hint, Dani Brown is my favorite, and it goes on my top 10 list. The next book on my list is Smoke Gets in Your Eyes by Caitlin Doherty. She's another YouTuber. She's Ask a Mortician on YouTube, and this is one of her first books. It's like a memoir of her time working in a crematory and her choice to get into going to like mortuary school and learning about the good death and what it means to have a good death. I've always loved her videos. I've been watching her for years now because I find her voice very pleasing to listen to. I think she talks about some fascinating stuff. I have always been a morbid little bitch, and I love learning about weird things that happen to people's bodies when they die and the weird places people die, what happens like when a corpse goes missing. Like, these are just fun tales. But Smoke Gets in Your Eyes takes you more on like the personal connection level with death, and like, you know, what it means to press the button to cremate your loved one, or what it means to just let someone else do it. And it puts more personal stake in it. And again, I hinted at this in my Christmas thing, but we've had some really kind of challenging stuff happening with my family recently, and it's really making me think about what it means when someone passes, and, you know, upholding their wishes, but also making sure there's still personal connection in death, and quit removing ourselves from the act of death and mourning. But I really enjoyed this book. It was funny, it was smart, it just felt like reading one of her YouTube videos, and I cannot wait to read more of her writing. The next book I read during the summer, actually during the reading rush, and it was The Astonishing Color of After by Emily X.R. Pan. This book made me cry. It was beautiful and moving, and I don't know why I suddenly read a lot of books that were about like death and mourning. It's weird. Maybe it's because this year has been so focused on what we have lost that I sought books that sort of dealt with that. And this one talks about a girl whose mom, you know, commits suicide, and her kind of meeting her family and learning to know her mom through her family that she never knew. And it's just, the fantasy elements in it do a great job of helping with the story rather than hindering. They actually drive the point home rather than taking away from the overall message that you can still grow and love and live while mourning the things you have lost. And I think that's a very important takeaway this year, if any year, for all of us. The next book I read that goes on my top 10 is The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett. I was in, full disclosure, a Southern Lit class my first year at school, and I was in a Faulkner class, which was just basically a study on specific Southern literature, and my teacher had us focus on passing and mixed race novels, and they were fascinating. It's just so interesting reading passing literature anyway. The fact that people had to choose to either be who they were or to pass as someone who could actually get along in the world for so long is just, that's such a hard choice. And this book really shows you what happens when that choice is made by 2 different sisters. The Vanishing Half is about 2 sisters who could pass for white in the town they live in, and one of them decides to do so. One of the sisters marries a white man. She lives in a white community. She has to put on sort of this costume of this racist white lady. That way she can get by in this gated community she lives in. And she luckily has a daughter that looks white, but she just knows that if she has any connection to her past, it could ruin her. Because that's the problem with passing. You have to pass over. You cannot come back. The other does the exact opposite. She marries the darkest man she can find. She has a daughter who she brings back to her very racist like town, and she's just, they describe her as being just blue-black, and how different that is from the members of this town because they all could pass for white. The daughters meet. One of the daughters ends up with a trans character, and there's this idea of passing as far as gender goes, and this is, mind you, in like the 70s that this part's happening. And I just love all the discussion about passing and the pros and cons of passing and what you leave behind because you are trying to pass as something that you are not, but the really difficult decision that it takes to make that choice. Do you want to be treated as a second-class citizen? Do you want to keep getting these bad jobs and be talked to this way? Or do you want to leave everything behind? And the trade-off is that you get to exist in the world as it was supposed to be, equal and fair. And that is just such a heavy discussion, but you get so invested in these characters. And God, I just really, really loved this book. I listened to it on audiobook to and from school. The few days we were able to go to school. But I just really, really enjoyed it. I don't know if the reading experience is the same way, but the audiobook was very good. But yeah, that was The Vanishing Half. Sorry, it kind of went into a little dissertation there a little bit. But I thought that was a very good book. The next book is one of the last ones I finished this year. It was Lovely War by Julie Berry, and it is a framed narrative of Aphrodite and Ares are cheating with each other, and she's cheating on her husband, and they get caught, and he kind of puts them on trial in a hotel room in the 1940s. So while they're on trial, she tells the story of these two couples that met and their love stories during World War I. So you keep coming from where the gods are talking in the 1940s to World War I and these characters, and Ares and Aphrodite and Apollo and Hades all have different aspects that they talk about. And it's just beautiful listening to their different voices. I really enjoyed the idea of the gods and goddesses talking about mortals and what they had to offer versus what the gods and goddesses can experience. It's that thing where, like, yeah, you're immortal, but what is life if it's not fleeting? Like, what is the power of love if you could live forever, And so I think that was a really nice exploration of that topic. But I thought The Lovely War was beautiful. It made me cry a couple times, but I'm a weepy bitch, so that just happens. But I really did like the way it was framed, and I thought it was a very interesting take on a historical fiction romance where it was also kind of fantasy. So that was nice. The last book we're going to talk about is Pam's Labyrinth, and that was a Guillermo del Toro movie, but this one, I think it was written and arranged by like Cornelia Funk, the lady who wrote Inkheart and The Thief Lord, which I loved in middle school, by the way. And this book, it did what the movie did. I was actually really shocked that they did what they did, because the movie, if you've seen Pan's Labyrinth, it is not exactly a happy ending. I mean, it's an ambiguous ending, right? You don't know if it's supposed to be a happy ending. The book makes it a little less ambiguous, and I can't decide if that's a good or a bad thing. Like I said, I love this. It's in my top 10, and I think it was a very good adaptation of the movie for like a YA audience or whatever. But I don't know how I like the idea of it not being as ambiguous now. You also get more into the head of different characters that you didn't really need to be, but that's how you had to see it, because in the movie where you'd have scenes of like the bad guy character on his own doing something, you have to narrate that in the book because it's a book. You gotta tell it, don't show it. But I did appreciate it. I think the writing was very beautiful. I think it felt very dramatic and weighty. And for someone who knew, again, how the book should have ended based on the movie, this was still really good to me, how things ended. And I like the little vignettes at the beginning of each section that took you into the past and showed you different like versions of the characters and things interacting with the fantasy elements. I just really enjoyed that. So if you're looking for something that's a little bit fantastical, but might also make you cry, Pam's Labyrinth is a good choice. So those were the top 10 books that I read this year. Obviously that list could have been a lot longer. And I don't know, I'm really pleased because I think last year I struggled to get like a top selection of books. And this year I just read a lot of really good ones. Now, I read a lot of really bad ones too, but like I've said, I think I'm going to stop reading arcs and forcing myself to finish books that I don't like. I'm going to give myself permission in 2021 to DNF books, because like life is too short for me not to finish all these books that are on my TBR.